Who was the loneliest person in recorded history and why? A man who at the age of 11 enrolled at Harvard University. William James Sidis. Born to Boris and Sarah Sidis in 1898, William's fate was perhaps written for him before he was even born. His Ukrainian parents were intellectual refugees who'd fled to the USA to escape political persecution. They were Jewish, so they were vulnerable to the pogroms. They were truly a power couple of the day. Boris was an eminent psychologist who attained 4 degrees from Harvard and would become known for his pioneering work in the realms of hypnosis and psychopathology. His mother was one of the few women of the time to attain a medical degree and be a practicing doctor. Boris' ambitions didn't stop at himself though, and he wished dearly to have a prodigious son. So when baby William arrived, he and his wife wasted no time in turning their son into the next Einstein. They bought him piles of books and resources. His father used certain psychological techniques on him, and his mother gave up work, all in their grand endeavor to foster a relentless hunger for knowledge within their son. Mission accomplished. William was able to read the New York Times at just 18 months old. He became proficient in 8 languages by the time he was 8 and gave a seminar on the 4th dimension at Harvard a year later. However, devoting a child's life to education and forcing him to forego pleasures of the heart left him emotionally stunted. Publicly, he would end up denouncing love, art, and sex as agents of an imperfect life, and said he had no interest in love whatsoever. Following his graduation from Harvard at the age of 16, cum laude no less, he got a job teaching mathematics at Rice University, but it was short-lived as evidently university-age students didn't take to being taught by a teenager. After that he attended Harvard Law School, but dropped out in his final year. Shortly thereafter, he took part in a communist-leaning demonstration and ended up arrested. In his trial he denounced capitalism, whilst also stating he didn't believe in God and advocated a socialist government. Stating such things at a trial in 1919 USA truly was a case of wrong time, wrong place. As a result, he was sentenced to prison for 18 months. He mostly avoided prison, something afforded to him by his parents' influence. However, he was in there for a brief spell and met Irish socialist Martha Farley, whom he befriended, before falling in love with her. His father arranged it so that, following sentencing, he would be kept at the family sanatorium for a year as an alternative to prison. Evidently not fond of his beliefs, they set about reforming him during his stint there, and even threatened to send him to an insane asylum at one point. Martha Farley. The life that his parents had built for him was one that had sown seeds of discontent. The bullying, the mockery and the harassment had all made him grow weary of life in public, and so even at 16, he'd already begun craving his perfect life, that is to say, a secluded life. 1921 and now free, the 30-year-old Sidis slipped away to live an isolated existence. He moved from city to city, doing menial jobs and adopting different aliases along the way to retain his anonymity. He became estranged from his parents and wrote dozens of books that were mostly glossed over, including a book devoted entirely to the subject of streetcar transfers. One of the overlooked gems amongst his writings was a theory that would later become known as the black hole theory, nearly 15 years before Subramanian Chandrasekhar's publication on the subject. Sidis, aged 45. For this period, he lived that perfect life, staying sequestered from society as much as possible. It was broken in the 1930s though, when a reporter from the New Yorker tracked Sidis down and pretended to befriend him so as to get a look into his life. The resulting article had all the integrity of a tabloid, denouncing him as a failure, dubbing his home shabby, calling him childlike, and recounted a story where he cried when faced with too much work to do. They'd run over his life with a fine-tooth comb and were determined to humiliate him. From 1937 onward, he ended up fighting a series of court battles over a number of years until he ended up getting a settlement in 1944. His victory was to be short-lived though, as 3 months later, his landlady found him unconscious in his flat. He'd suffered a brain hemorrhage. He never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead shortly thereafter, aged just 46. The only possession on his person at the time of his death was a picture of Martha Farley, the only woman he'd ever loved, despite her having been happily married to another man for well over a decade. I believe that in their quest for a glory child, his parents' methods of raising him precluded emotional development. Not being allowed to explore and develop in that regard has serious consequences. I think rather than being emotionally uninterested, that he did have those feelings, but largely chose to block them out because he was scared of them. He hadn't developed the toolkit to handle adult emotions, so they were something foreign and scary to him. Adult emotions overpowering a child's heart, if you will. Hiroo Onoda. A photo of Hiroo Onoda as a young officer. The Second World War ended on September 2, 1945, when representatives of Imperial Japan signed the Instrument of Unconditional Surrender to the United States and other allied powers. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signs the Instrument of Surrender aboard the US Missouri, the 2nd of September 1945. But for Hiroo Onoda, the Second World War actually ended on the 9th of March, 1974. To understand why Onoda fought his own war for so long, we have to understand the nation and culture from which he came. Japan before and during WWII was an exceptionally distinctive culture. Its warrior class, the samurai, had long had a tradition of fanatical loyalty and unwillingness to surrender. They were expected to commit ritual suicide, rather than allow themselves to fall into the hands of the enemy. It was the honorable way to die. Somewhere during the modern period of Japanese history, this mindset moved from the warrior class to becoming ingrained in the minds of every Japanese citizen. The societal expectation for every man, and as the war progressed, women and children too, was that they would die for Japan, if they needed to, that they would never surrender, and that they would accept the deaths of millions, even tens of millions, if it meant the survival of Japan's honor. The Japanese soldiers were unquestionably the most fanatical and ferocious soldiers in any theater of war during WWII. When American Marines liberated Saipan from Japanese control, virtually no Japanese soldiers survived, and 10,000 Japanese women and children committed suicide to avoid capture. Countless incidents like this were seen all around the Pacific as the Allies won victories against the Japanese. Hiroo Onoda's words perfectly capture the pervading pressure operating on the Japanese people. After all, this is what we Japanese had all vowed to each other. We had sworn that we would resist the American and English devils until the last single one of us was dead. If necessary, the women and children would resist with bamboo sticks. Japanese children training with bamboo spears. The newspapers of Japan, propaganda outlets of the state, echoed similar sentiments, printing slogans like "struggle to the end," "the empire must be protected at any cost," and "100 million dying for the cause." Before thinking, as the American troops who encountered Japanese resistance often did, that the Japanese were somehow inhuman or a different species. Any of us could have been born in the 1920s in Japan and we would have become products of the same cultural forces that would have us leaping off those cliffs. Hiroo Onoda was sent to Lugano Island in the Philippines in late 1944 with his unit. Before he left, his superior officer told him, "Whatever happens, we'll come back for you." By this point in the war, Japan was essentially doomed, and the hope was that his unit could delay American attacks as long as possible. Onoda's unit was overwhelmed by American attacks in early 1945. Him and 3 other soldiers fled into the jungled mountains of Lubang Island to hold out. The surrender of Japan came and went. The 4 soldiers continued to hold out for years, even as American planes dropped leaflets and newspapers announcing the surrender and showing normal life in Japan. Onoda and his friends dismissed the surrender as propaganda to draw them out, and Onoda himself concluded, the newspapers could not be real, for that would mean that the war was over, and if the war were really over there should be no life in Japan. So him and his comrades held out for years, which quickly became decades. 2 soldiers of his group were killed in the years after the war, leaving only him and 1 other friend to hold out in the mountains of Lubang. Onoda was not alone. Tens of thousands of rogue Japanese soldiers did not heed the surrender order or simply didn't hear of it. In 1948, a whole unit of 200 men was captured in the jungle with its heavy equipment. Lone stragglers or small groups continued to be found throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Onoda, though, held out longer than almost every one of them. Onoda's last friend and comrade was killed in a shootout with the local police in 1972. From this point on, Onoda was totally alone. This is when I think Hiroo Onoda was the loneliest man in history. Fighting a solitary battle, living in the jungle among nature away from any other humans, upholding a long dead cause, and waging a long forgotten war. In 1974, a traveler decided to search for him and ended up finding him. Even after receiving undeniable proof that the war was over, Onoda refused to surrender unless his commanding officer came back and relieved him of his duty. And so he did. His officer, after so many years, fulfilled the promise that he would come back. Hiro Onoda handing over his sword. On March 9, 1974, almost 30 years after Onoda had set out from his home to fight the war of his life, he gave up his ghost, forgot his loneliness, and returned to civilization. Everybody remembers the first two men to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Though, there was also a third man aboard Apollo 11. Can you remember his name? Considering how overlooked he is, the chances are slim. His name was Michael Collins. Collins was an essential part of the Apollo 11 mission. While Neil and Buzz were bumming it out on the moon's surface, Collins was in charge of the command module that would allow the team to return to Earth. This was no easy task either. Collins was in orbit around the moon for roughly a 22-hour time span. Yet, this wasn't the worst of it. As Collins orbited around the far side of the moon, there was a 47-minute period where the moon completely blocked Earth. During those 47 minutes, all of Collins' communications were rendered inoperable. He was completely and utterly alone. At the time, NASA declared, "Not since Adam has man known such solitude." Or inspiring as NASA's quote may have been, only Collins' own words truly captured the gravity of his isolation. This venture has been structured for 3 men, and I consider my third to be as necessary as either of the other 2. I don't mean to deny a feeling of solitude. It is there, reinforced by the fact that radio contact with the Earth abruptly cuts off at the instant I disappear behind the moon. I'm alone now, truly alone, and absolutely isolated from any known life. I'm it. If a count were taken, the score would be 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the moon, and 1 plus God knows what on this side. Statement from Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins. The first 2 men to land in the Sea of Tranquility may have accomplished one of humanity's greatest achievements. Nevertheless, Michael Collins achieved a level of tranquility beyond what any human has, or perhaps ever will, know. Michael Collins might not be the first astronaut people think of when they hear the words Apollo 11. Though, I'll always have a unique reverence for the role he played in that mission. Nikola Tesla. He was a weird scientist. He never married, and had no children. Not to belittle his achievements, he was a genius, though a lonely one. He claimed to keep his ideas inside of his brain, to keep them from being stolen, and therefore avoided human interactions. He practiced celibacy. Even though he never loved a woman, he once developed an unusual relationship with a pigeon, which he said, "I loved that pigeon as a man loves a woman, and she loved me." He hated the idea of getting married. I do not think you can name many great inventions that have been made by married men. Nikola Tesla. He died at the age of 85, broke and lonely. To reiterate, Tesla was a genius, though a lonely one, and had many patents to his name. His quotes about being alone. The mind is sharper and keener in seclusion and uninterrupted solitude. Originality thrives in seclusion, free of outside influences beating upon us to cripple the creative mind. Be alone, that is the secret of invention. Be alone, that is when ideas are born. Nikola Tesla. He died alone in his hotel suite. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like this video. Love y'all.